Okay, so yeah, we will slowly start, I think, and just allow other people to join us as they come. So welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining in. I will just say a few words about myself first, so you have a bit of an idea about me. My name is Marta Januszewska, and I work at Spill Response. I've been there for the last 9 years, almost 9 years now. I first started at the business development department, and then I moved on to become a regional rep for Europe and Caspian region. And for the last 3 years, I'm with consultancy department. I do a lot of, you can call side projects with OSRL in terms of plastic response and surveillance core group as well. And some another interest of mine is also the diversity, equity and inclusion subjects, which we have an internal group in OSRL that works on that subject. And my presentation is kind of a combination between the instant command system with the D&I lens on it. So it's kind of a little bit different way of looking at the leadership and anything that can affect it. My educational background is in oceanography and political science. So again, a bit of a mix of it too. So throughout the presentation, I will show you some slides and some of the research and things that I gathered to prove some of the points I will be talking about. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I think it's best if we take the questions, leave the questions at the end. But please feel free, if something comes to your mind, just write it down in the chat so we can then refer to it at the end. Okay, so I will just share presentation with you. Okay, let me see if you can see it well. Some thumbs up. Yeah, okay, great, perfect, thank you. So the subject is, are we biased against our best leaders? So basically we'll be talking about how bias can affect the leadership and decisions that leaders make in terms of how they recruit their teams, but also how team sees their leaders or how they choose them. So before we get to the main presentation, I also wanted to do a short exercise with all of you. And I cannot see you because your cameras are off, but what I would like you to do is just to either close your eyes or just focus on my voice and think about the first thing that comes to your head when you heard me talking. So did you notice my accent first? If you were to imagine how I look based, well, now you can see me, but if you were imagine to just listen to my voice and imagine how I look, what would you think as I look as, you know, as a person? If I were to be introduced to you as an incident commander on the phone call, and you would hear my voice, would you have trust in my skills? Would you think maybe she's quite young, maybe she's a woman? Does it matter? Is it, you know, what would your feelings be if this would be the case? So these are some of the questions that we're kind of looking a bit closer later part of the presentation. So we will dive a bit deeper into this bias that can influence the leadership. So starting at the beginning with the bias, what the bias actually is. It's a particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, or opinion, especially one that is preconceived or unreasoned. And we have two types of bias. There is one that is implicit, which is an unconscious one, and there is an explicit one, which is the conscious one. So the unconscious one is often done without realizing. So typically based on our worldviews or experiences that we came across when we were growing up, potentially, you know, the place that where we were born, we were raised, that affects quite a lot of our unconscious bias. The conscious one, as it stands, is done intentionally and knowingly. So it's an active choice that you will be biased against someone or something. So most of us will have both, even though we like to think that we are not really biased and we are really fair. But most of the time, it is the fact that we all have both of the biases, both the unconscious one and the conscious one, even if we don't tend to speak about it. So now, how does it play when it comes to the bias of the leaders and the team members? So typically, our willingness to follow a crisis leader will depend on if we judge them worthy. So if our perception, it also depends very much, it's very linked to our perception of worthiness. Is it based on the known performance, or is it based on our biased assumptions of who should be leading? So, for example, we might be biased against people of certain age, gender, or racial group, and we may question their ability to be an effective leader. Maybe not trust them, that they will represent our interests because they are not similar to us. Equally, looking from the other perspective of the team leader, the leader can overlook team members who are different based on external factors, such as age, race, sex, or disability, or gender rather than sex. In an oil and gas industry where the employees are mostly male, we will see these characteristics of a leader or a person that should lead us mostly as a male, older guy, professional looking figure. So with that in mind, as a result, females actually, and different racial and ethnic backgrounds, young people will have less opportunities to be equally included. And it's not only equally included in the team, but also in the career pathway that can lead them to become a leader. So it's not only unfair, it also means that we are missing out on quite a large talent pool that can be used. So the other point that to making here also is that if we don't trust the leader because of the bias that we might have against them, we will waste our time to question their instructions. We will try to maybe question some of the things they do. We will not necessarily be quick to follow the orders. So we will just not listen it, and that makes the command less efficient. So it comes from both ways, both the leader's perspective, but also the team members as well. So like I said, every one of us has a bias. There was an interesting study, well, two studies actually done by one of the researchers. One of them was done by the researchers at the Ontario Institute in Canada. And some of the collaborators included people or researchers from US, UK, France, and China. And they showed that 6 to 9 months old infants demonstrate racial bias in favor of members of their own race, and racial bias against those of other races. And the way how they prove that is that the infants begin to associate own race faces with happy music, and the other race faces with a sad music. So they tend to be associating something happy with when they saw people that are similar to them. And also what they also found is that the 6 to 8 months old infants were more inclined to learn information from an adult that looked similar to them. So that's already a bias showing at such an early age. As an adult, we use what we call these mental shortcuts. And that's something that we were equipped during the time of our evolution as a Homo sapiens, trying to survive the hostile environment. What it means is that there is this rapid processing that occurs when our brain makes the quick judgments. And we make quick judgments of people, of situations around us, just to understand whether it is a danger to us or not. And that's something that sits deep in us, and it's quite difficult to change because that's just how we operate, how our brain operates. And this can lead sometimes to unconscious bias, depending on how, what kind of biases we were exposed to. And that will be linked, like I mentioned, to our background, our culture, our personal experience. It can also mean that these biases can lead to outgroups being treated less favorably and even discriminated because we don't see them as being one of us. So we will not, we will not want them to be included. So there are these two things that we should bear in mind. So how does it do? How is it connected to the leadership bias? And I have some question that I prepared in here. So please feel free to give your answers in the chat. I will ask question first, and then I will wait to get some ideas from you. First of the question is, when 1 in 10 senior leaders at their company is a woman, what % of a men and what % of a woman think women are well represented in leadership? So 1 in 10 senior leaders is a woman. So what do you think men think? Is it a lot of women or is it not a lot of women? And again, what women think, if it's a lot or not. If you just give me a percentage, let's say, I don't know, men think they are represented 50% or 100% or so. Simon is typing. Let's see. Okay. Okay, that's interesting, Simon. Okay. So we have 50 from men and 10 from women from Simon. Pradi Kumar said 50%. I'm not sure if it's men or women. And then Einar said 70% men, 30% women. So, okay. So we saw a bit of we can see a bit of a bias with men thinking it's quite a lot, 20%. Okay. That's interesting. Okay. Just waiting for Eric. Okay, that's interesting. So the answer that comes from the research is actually 44% of men and 22% of women. So men thought, almost half of the men thought that it's quite a good representation of women, having one woman in 10 men, whereas women thought it's 22%. They agree with that. So it's some of you were quite close to that number, actually. Eric, that's quite interesting statement. It would be interesting to hear what's standing behind that as well. Okay, I'll get to the next question. So how many times more often do men interrupt women than other men? This is more in times rather than percent, so you can say 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, okay? 2 to 1, okay. Robert, you know the answer, you shouldn't be answering that. Okay, that's interesting. So that the answer is actually 3 times more often. So women are interrupted 3 times more often than men when they speak. Well, actually, Robert didn't remember it very well. It's free. Okay, let's get to the next question then. How much more likely was a woman to get an interview if her resume pictured her without the hijab compared to picturing her with a hijab? Okay, that's quite high. We have 5, 7, 5 times, 3 times, 70%. Okay, let's see the answer now. So it's actually 3 times more likely. So you were going higher with what the answer actually was, but it also shows that you have awareness of these situations and it happens, and unfortunately it happens quite often. Okay, the last one then. In one study, job applicants with white-sounding names got what percentage more callbacks than identical job applicants with black-sounding names? That's the percentage again. Very good, thank you, Einar. 30%, okay. Great, thank you for that. So the answer is 50% more. So you were quite close with your numbers, actually. So it kind of shows you that there's quite a lot of bias around there, and regardless of what we say about the fact that people are not really biased, the numbers are there. So how this all links into the leadership bias, I don't know if you're aware of the Harvard Implicit Association test. So there are really interesting tests available online, or all of us can do it. And you can test different kind of implicit associations with related to different subjects. So there are some about whether you are biased or you have some kind of association against the race, against women or gender in general. There's a few more. There isn't one that relates strictly to leadership, But out of the other, some of the other research that leads to a career, 76% of us tend to associate male with a career and female with a family. So it kind of gives you an idea of like when you watch, when you do the test, you have to link different things with, and then it measures your reaction time. And that's basically what came out of it. So 70% of us associate male with career and female with family. So what we expect is to men to be more career focused, and we expect them to be more in charge. So basically that's what it means. And then with women, we always think they should be more focused on the family rather than their career. And then, you know, that's kind of a source of a lot of questions that comes why things are more male dominated, and whether we will take instructions from women as readily during an incident. Okay, so now moving on with the characteristics of good leaders. So if you think about, you know, what kind of characteristics you would like for your good leaders to have. So the first thing comes to mind, and you know, most of these are based on the research or the study that was done following the Macondo. So it relates to the commanders and the leaders that were there during the Macondo incident, the oil spill in Gulf of Mexico. So what they said is they expect good leaders to have a knowledge. They expect to be effective during prior events, so they have some experience previously, and also demonstrated capacity to function under pressure. So the three things that were mentioned were these. So, but also studies shows that we are actually quite biased on how we interpret experience. So if someone fits our profile, then we think if someone fits our profile as a leader, then we think they are actually more experienced than someone who has identical experience but doesn't necessarily fit that profile. So we already kind of show a bias then, even though, you know, we don't know how good the leaders they are. So, you know, if you think that maybe you are selecting someone on amount of knowledge that they have, but it's actually quite open to interpretation. So studies shows that we judge those that do not fit our image much harsher, of who could fill the role. The ones that we don't really fit our image, we will judge them more harshly than the ones that fit. So that's basically what it is. So and also what was interesting is that and on one study, when a woman's name was replaced with a man's name on the resume, they were actually 60% more likely to be hiring that applicant just from the change of the name. So what we should really question ourselves is whether we are truly objective in the way how we see the leaders and how we position ourselves to make the choices, and whether our choices are objective. And, you know, the way how we look at the leaders is already biased, or whether we are actually objective. So the slide was on what we think the characteristics are, and then the next one is what the characteristics actually are. So based on, you know, the studies and some of the research done, so good leaders are actually not remembered by their actions or what they said in particular moment, but mostly how they made their team members feel. So it's about the feeling that you get from your leader. It's about the fact that you are being heard. It's about the fact that, you know, you're not afraid of them. You can talk to them. So when it comes to men versus woman leadership, it's not just that we are looking broader as well, but this particular case is, if we were to compare the two styles of leaderships, many people tend to describe women as more caring, more communicative, team building, multitasking in style, whereas men would be more describing as the leaders who are more commanding, controlling, more competitive, and focus on results, on the tasks. But what we should actually do is walk away from that leadership style based on the gender, because it puts quite the stereotypical frames where, you know, in some cases, women leaders who are hard, demanding or competitive, or men who are more nurturing or team orientated, they are seen as a deviation. And that's something, I don't know if you I read one book about the woman leaders, and that was one of the arguments they made there, that, you know, if woman doesn't fit the typical woman leader doesn't fit the typical woman image, she's seen or she's judged more harshly. So that's quite interesting because, you know, even though she's really effective as a leader, but because she doesn't fit the stereotypical frames of a woman, she might not necessarily be judged as fair as if she would be a man, for example. So what it means is that diversity in leadership doesn't mean that, you know, we should have more female leaders. That's not what we are striving for. What we try to do is that we should extend this beyond the gender frames and biases and stereotypes and focus on merit. So people are good in what they do, and that's the basis that we are choosing them to do. So you might know this lady here on the slide. Her name is Jacinda Ardern, and she's a Prime Minister of New Zealand. So what was interesting is that if you read the news that describe her leadership style, this is what they wrote about her. So Ardern is imperfect, and her government usually struggles to implement its agenda, whether house building or climate change action. But one aspect where the Prime Minister and her government excel is dealing with an immediate crisis. And that was something that she proved during some of the attacks that happened in New Zealand on the mosque and also during the COVID crisis. So it's quite interesting that, you know, even though the media judged her as being not really effective as a government, as a leader of the government, however, in the crisis, she was extremely efficient and extremely extremely good leader. So, you know, what's the right thing to do in here? And so what we can lose if we don't consider women during the crisis management. What is interesting is that women are actually more often disproportionately affected by the disaster. And that comes from the reason because they are mostly the main caregivers and they, with not the caregivers to children, but also to the family members, to elderly. So, for example, in 2014, during the Ebola epidemic in Liberia, women were estimated to make up 75% of those who died during the epidemic. And UNICEF also estimated up to 60% of those who died in Sierra Leone were women as well. So, you know, it's really high number if you compare. Women are also more vulnerable to rape and domestic abuse during times of crisis. So some of the solutions that are being created for people, for refugees that are potentially fleeing from places, they need to also include the solutions that are fit to women. So, for example, one of the case was the storm shelters in Bangladesh, where there wasn't a separated sex changing room for toilets. Sorry, mixed sex toilets. So it was very unsuitable for women who would not normally be mixing with men. And it created quite a lot of dangerous situations for them because they were really exposed. So they just didn't go to the shelters, they didn't go to the toilets, and that, you know, causes issues by itself. And also one of the other examples that was given was 1991 cyclone, where the flood and the death rate for women was 5 times more than that of a man. And with the example closer to home in UK, the government was actually criticized for handling the lockdowns during the COVID times. And the reason and the decision that was made to close schools. And it was suggested that the key decision makers were actually male, because none of them thought what kind of impact it will have on the primary parents, who are typically women, because they will be the ones most often staying at home and taking care of kids, or trying to put them through the school system or through school tasks that they will be assigned to. So that was quite interesting as well. That it's happening. There is typically a reluctance to factor in gender differences in disaster management, as it's seen as a more social problem to solve. However, what we've seen and what I was just talking about is that women are more likely to be able to come up with solutions to a crisis that work for women. So it's extremely important to, in the team that comes up with the solutions, to have women, because that will just basically make it more inclusive, and the outcomes potentially could be much less worse than what we have seen that happened in some of the epidemic and other disasters. Okay, so what can we do? Is there anything we can do at the moment? Well, I think, the fact that you're here on the webinar and you're interested in a subject that already is very good and very promising. Google coined this term called unbiasing. So it's more about what we can do in our work environments, what we can do as a people. And some of the examples they gave was build work environments embracing differences. So consciously, as a leader or as a manager, choosing teams that are different to you, that have different views to you, so they can challenge you, they can show you words from different perspectives. Step out of comfort zone when looking for coworkers, opinion bosses. Don't go to the same people that you always go to different people and ask them. And even if you don't like the answer, think about it and try to think, maybe, maybe it does make sense. Maybe I should think about it from different perspective. Try to think what about your unconscious biases. What is it? I know I have plenty, and there is a lot of time when, I look at something and I have to think, oh, it's not really fair to think like this. So you can catch yourself from doing these things. And then as long as you realize it and this is your bias and it's not really, that's something you can change. You can also raise awareness about unconscious bias. So you can speak with people, you can challenge their views in the discussions, you can prove to them that, that they are showing the bias against something or someone. You can also hold everyone accountable. So if you come across it, just state it. Tell them it's not fair to do this. It's not okay. And also gather data and measure decisions. And that specifically relates to the organizations that you work at. So without the data and without understanding how the decisions are made, you cannot understand if there is any kind of a bias going on in the background. So that's quite useful thing to do, and also to see how it changes throughout the time. So there's a lot of things we can do at the moment, us as individuals and also us as organizations. And that's pretty much it from my side. So if anyone has any questions, I will be happy to take them. I think there were quite interesting comments from Simon with regards to the blind recruitment should be the norm, 100%. And then from Robert, an example of blind recruitment, implementing auditions. Yes. I've seen that research as well about the musicians, exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Simon. I think we have something coming up from Einar. Thank you very much, Einar. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to write in the chat or ask me. In, I'm not sure if you can unmute or if it's automatic actually, but chat is a good place to ask as well. I think we have coming. Thank you, Robert. Did you read it all? Oh, okay. You just enabled. Okay, so Einar asked the question whether how do you think we shall fight against bias? Is it even possible? Yes, Einar, and the last slide I shared with what we can do as individuals and as an organization, it's definitely showing that. So, the good start is always doing some reading. And when I was preparing for the presentation and for the paper itself, I read quite a few books about biases and how we can fight against them, and being informed, being conscious in your decisions, it's always a good start. So just thinking about some of the things that come to your head when you see a certain situation or a certain people, and whether you tend to think about them negatively or positively, and why would be that the issue. And also in the team, like I mentioned, if you are a manager, if you are the one recruiting the team, what are your criteria to recruit this team, whether you are objective and you are looking for diversity in your team and in your organization as well, because we now have a conscious choice of choosing to work for organizations that are more diverse. So there's a lot of things we can do for sure, definitely. Thank you, Eric. Thanks a lot for listening. Have some more questions? Okay, so another comment from Einar was, I faced with bias as a woman from men and cannot sometimes change their thoughts. Yes, and I work in the oil and gas industry, and that's something that I come across quite often as well. And the only thing is that I tend to think in that kind of situation is just to endure and to stay and to fight and to be there, to be present and to be strong and to get to the leadership position and show them that their things can be done in a different way. So I think that's the best thing you can do, really, to show that there will be a bias. And I understand that people work in different environments, but that's the best thing you can do. Okay, so there's some questions about the recording. So yes, this is recorded, so we will share it on the website. Thank you, Sine, for your comment. About very interesting and thought-provoking. Any other questions? Okay, so there's another question from Pradeep Kumar about how important is it to assess skills and competencies in the recruitment process, or is it also a symptom of bias? Where it isn't, actually, because what I was talking about earlier was the fact that the best thing to do is to choose people on merit. So rather than looking at whether they're men or women, or whether they fit the profile that we think we should have, they should finish certain schools, or we definitely should look at what they represent, like the skills and competencies that they have. So it doesn't matter which background they come from. If they represent the skills and competencies that we are looking for, we should give them a chance, to come for an interview and represent their skills. So I wouldn't see this as a symptom of bias. I would actually see this as a best way to do your recruitment process, to look at skills and competencies rather than a person as itself. And then as Simon made a statement, if a baby can demonstrate bias, as you stated, then what can be done to elevate that bias at the early development stages? This is a really good question, Simon, and that's something I was actually discussing with my friend who has 2 young children, and unfortunately her children was showing signs of that, and she was horrified because she never thought that would be the case. And from what I know, and I try to do with my child as well, is to expose them to different kinds of environments. So go out, meet different people, make sure that they are meeting different people and they can see people being around them, and they can see this as being a normal working environment, normal world that we are living in. That will change their view of seeing people in a certain situations. Or I don't know if you noticed, but some of the quite a lot of books nowadays for kids, they have quite a lot of diversity in them as well. So kids are not only looking at characters that are similar to them. They have a range of characters that are presented in the book. So there's few things that we can do at the early stage. Definitely. Okay, any other questions do we have? Stop sharing. Oh, thank you, Robert. That's a really nice comment. I'm glad you liked it, and I'm glad that I was able to share some good books with you as well. Okay, I think we don't have any more questions. I will just move to the last slide where you can see my email. If you have any further questions or any points that you would like to discuss or raise, my email is there on the screen, so please feel free to write. I will be very glad to hear from you. And thank you very much for joining today.